The Memoirs of Sergeant Bourgogne offer a personal account of his experiences during Napoleon's Russian campaign. He describes the harsh realities faced by the French soldiers. These are his words. On November 18th, the day after the Battle of Krasnoi, we set out very early from our bivouac. The march was a sad and weary one, and terribly tiring. There was a thaw, our feet were wet through, and all day the fog was so thick we could see nothing. Our men were still in some sort of order, but the fighting of the preceding days and the forced abandonment of their imploring comrades had demoralized them. The same fate, no doubt, they thought was in store for them. I was terribly tired that day. One of the men in our company, named l'Abbé, seeing that I could scarcely walk, offered to carry my knapsack for me, as he had lost his own the day before. I gave it to him, as I knew he was honest, but it was like trusting my life in his hands, as the knapsack contained more than a pound of rice and oatmeal picked up by chance at Smolensk, and kept by me for some desperate emergency, when there would be no more horses to eat. On that day the emperor went on foot, carrying a stick. At night it froze again, and the roads became so slippery that we fell down continually, and many were seriously hurt. I walked last of the company, keeping an eye as far as possible on the man with my knapsack, and sometimes regretting that I had given it up and resolving to get it back when we stopped for the night. When night came, it was so dark that it was impossible to see anything. I called out, "L'Abbé, l'Abbé!" and I heard him answer, "Here, Sergeant." But when I called again later, one of our men told me that he had just fallen down and was probably following the regiment. I did not worry myself about it, as in a short time we should be obliged to come to a halt and take up a position for the night. When we did so, the whole army was collected, except Marshal Ney's corps d'armée, which had dropped behind and which we feared was lost. Everyone did as best he could during this wretched night. Several of us, non-commissioned officers, joined together and took possession of a barn. We were close to a village without being aware of it. Many of the men had entered with us, but those who came too late for that mounted on the roof. Just then we were told that further on there was a church, Greek, intended for our regiment's shelter, but that now it was filled with men from different regiments who would let no one else enter. On learning exactly where the church was, a dozen of us set out to find it. When we arrived, the men inside tried to prevent our entering. They were Germans, Italians, and a few Frenchmen, who tried to frighten us by presenting the points of their bayonets at us. We answered them in the same fashion, and forced an entrance. They drew back a little, and an Italian called out, "Do as I do. Load!" "Ours are loaded. Ready," said one of our sergeant majors, and we were on the point of a fierce encounter when reinforcements arrived for us in the shape of some men from our regiment. So seeing they had nothing to gain by fighting and that we were not disposed to let them stay with us, the men in the church decided to leave. Unfortunately for them, the night grew much colder, with a high wind and a fall of snow. And the next morning on going out, we found many of the poor wretches dead by the side of the road. Others had dropped down further on while trying to find a place of shelter. We passed by these dead bodies in silence. We ought, no doubt, to have felt guilty and miserable at this sad spectacle of which we were partly the cause. But we had arrived at the point of complete indifference to everything, even the most tragic events, saying to each other that soon we should be eating dead men, as there would be no more horses left. An hour afterwards we got to Dubrovnik, a little town partly inhabited by Jews, where all the houses were built of wood. Here the emperor had passed the night, with the grenadiers and chasseurs and part of the artillery. They had been kept under arms all night by a false alarm. We crossed this town on our way to Orsha. After an hour's march, we had to pass over a deep ravine, which the baggage had enormous difficulty in crossing, and several horses died. At last, During the afternoon, we arrived at this little fortified town, garrisoned by men from different regiments. These were men who had stayed behind and had come up in detachments to rejoin the Grand Army. There were amongst them some gendarmes and a few Poles. They were horror-struck at seeing our miserable condition and at the enormous number of stragglers in such disorganization. Part of the guard were kept in the town to establish a little order, and a small distribution of flour and brandy was made from some stores found there. We found a pontoon train and a great deal of artillery, horses, and harness, and by an extraordinary fatality, we burned the boats forming the bridges in order to make use of the horses to draw the guns. We little knew what was in store for us at the Berezina, where the bridge would have been of untold service to us. We were now only 7,000 or 8,000 men in the guard, the remnant of 35,000. Although most of us marched in order, a good many straggled painfully behind. As I have already said, the emperor and part of the guard stayed in the town and the rest of the army camped outside. During the night, Marshal Ney arrived with the remainder of his corps d'armée. 2,000 or 3,000 remained to him out of 7,000. The emperor's joy was unbounded when he heard that the marshal was safe. We stayed here over the 20th, and I spent the time looking for my friend with my knapsack, but in vain. On the 21st we set out without my having found him, and I began to despair, although I heard from many that he had been seen. At a short distance from Orca we heard musket shots, and stopping for a moment we saw some sledges intercepted by Cossacks. These men joined our ranks and we went forward again. I searched for my man and the knapsack among the sledges, but again fruitlessly. We stayed that night in a village called Kokano, of which nothing remained but a barn and 2 or 3 houses. On the 22nd, after a wretched night, we set out very early, walking with great difficulty over a thawed, muddy road. At midday, we reached Tolotin, where the emperor had slept. We halted at the other side of the town and drew up by the side of the road. While we were there, Monsieur Césaris, an officer in our company, told me that he had seen l'Abbé near a fire busy frying biscuits and that he had ordered him to join his regiment. He answered that he was coming directly, but a horde of Cossacks came and took possession of the sledges, and most probably he had been taken also. So goodbye to my knapsack and its contents, which I had so set my heart on taking back to France. How proud I should have been to say, I brought this from Moscow. However, to make quite sure, I thought I would see for myself, and I turned back to the end of the village, which was full of men from all regiments, walking about independently and obeying no orders but their own. I saw the Cossacks in the distance carrying off their prisoners, and no doubt my poor knapsack also. I was looking about me to right and left when I caught sight of a woman, dressed in a soldier's cloak, looking curiously at me, and I could not help thinking I had seen her before. She recognized me by my bearskin, and being the first to speak, she said she had seen me at Smolensk. I remembered her as the woman in the cellar. She told me that the brigands had been taken at Krasnoi before we got there, that they were in a house where they had beaten her because she would not wash their shirts and she had gone out to get water. She had seen some Russians and had run away. As for the brigands, they had fought desperately, trying to save their money, for they had much, she said, gold and jewels above all. But it had ended by their being killed, wounded, and plundered. She herself had been saved. When the Imperial Guard arrived, she would have told me much more if I had had time to listen to her. I asked her who was with her, and she said no one. That since the day her husband was killed, she had been with the brigands, that she was now alone, but that if I would take her under my protection, she would take good care of me, and I should be doing her a very great service. I consented at once, never thinking of the figure I should cut in the regiment when I arrived there with a woman. As she went, she asked me what had become of my knapsack, so I told her its history and how I had lost it. She told me not to worry about it, as she had a well-filled bag herself. She also carried a basket on her arm, and she added that if I could find a house or a stable to change in, she could give me some fresh linen. I accepted this joyfully, but as we were looking for a suitable place, we heard the call to arms. And I heard the drums beating. I told the woman to follow me and wait for me on the road. When I joined my company, the sergeant major asked me if I had found l'abbé and the knapsack. I said no, and that I had given up all idea of finding them, but that instead I had found a woman. A woman, he exclaimed. What is the good of that? She can't wash your linen for you, as you have not got any. She will give me some. Ah, he said, that's a different thing. And what about feeding her? She will do as I do. Just then, the emperor came past with King Murat and Prince Eugène. The emperor then placed himself amongst the grenadiers and chasseurs, and made them an address telling them that the Russians were waiting for us at the crossing of the Berezina, and had sworn that not one of us should pass over. Then, drawing his sword and raising his voice, he cried, Let us all swear to die fighting, rather than not see our country again. The oath was taken. Bearskins and caps were waved at the points of bayonets, and shouts were heard of Vive l'Empereur! Marshal Mortier made us a similar address, and was received with the same enthusiasm, and so on with all the regiments. It was a splendid moment, and for the time made us forget our miseries. If the Russian had only been within our reach then, we should have made short work of them, even at their numbers being 6 times greater than ours. We remained in this position till the right wing of the column began to move. I had not forgotten my wife, and while waiting for the regiment to start, I went in search of her, but she was nowhere to be seen. She had been engulfed in the torrent of Prince Eugène's thousands. They and the corps belonging to Marshals Ney and Davoust were in complete disorder. 3/4 of them were sick and wounded, and the rest utterly demoralized and indifferent to everything. I found myself at this moment near Marshal Lefebvre. He was alone and on foot in the middle of the road, shouting in his German accent, "Come, my men, let us get together. Better large battalions than a pack of brigands and cowards." He spoke to the men who were continually straggling away without apparent reason from their corps, sometimes in front, sometimes behind. I made several inquiries about my wife, as I so badly wanted the change of linen she had promised me, but I never saw her again, and so I found myself bereft both of her and of my knapsack. Walking thus with the rabble, I had got far in advance of my regiment, and I stopped to rest by a fire left from a bivouac. Up to the Battle of Krasnoi, I had managed to keep up my spirits, in spite of all the miseries I had to endure. I felt that the greater the danger and suffering, the greater the glory and honor, and my patience had astonished my comrades. But since the terrible encounters at Krasnoi, and above all since the news that 2 of my friends, besides Bellocchi and Capon, had been, one killed and the other mortally wounded, sick. To complete my misery, a sledge came up and stopped close to me. I asked who the wounded man was, and they told me it was an officer of their regiment. It turned out to be poor Legrand, who related to me the way he had been wounded. His comrade Laporte from Cassel, near Lille, had stayed behind, invalided at Krasnoi, but hearing that his regiment was fighting, he set out to join it. Hardly, however, had he taken his place in the ranks, when he had both his legs broken. Legrand, seeing Laporte arrive, came to speak to him, and the same shot wounded him in the right leg. Laporte remained dead on the battlefield, and Legrand was taken to the town. He was placed in a wretched Russian cart drawn by a miserable horse, but the cart broke up the first day. Fortunately for him, close by was a sledge, into which he was moved. 4 men of his regiment were with him, and he had travelled in this manner for 6 days. I bade farewell to the unfortunate Legrand and wished him a safe journey. He answered that he trusted himself to the care of God and the friendship of his brave comrades. One of the men then took the horse by the bridle, another gave it a blow, and 2 pushed from behind. With great difficulty, the sledge was thus set in motion. As I saw it off, I thought with such equipment it could hardly go much further. After this, I never felt the same. I was depressed and a prey to gloomy forebodings. My head ached and burned. I was in a fever. No doubt it was greatly owing to fatigue, as we were now obliged to start very early in the morning and walk till very late. The days were so short, it was not light till 8 o'clock, and it was dark by 4 in the afternoon. This was the reason of so many unfortunate men losing their way, for it was always night when we arrived at the bivouac, and all the remains of the different corps were in terrible confusion. At all hours of the night we heard the weak, worn-out voices of new arrivals calling out, 4th Corps, 1st Corps, 3rd Corps, Imperial Guard. And then the voices of others lying down with no strength left, forcing themselves to answer, "Here, comrades!" They were not trying any longer to find their regiments, but simply the corps d'armée to which they had belonged, and which now included the strength of 2 regiments at most, where a fortnight earlier there had been 30. No one now knew anything about himself, or could mention which regiment he belonged to. Many, after working the whole day, were forced to wander about half the night to find their particular corps. They hardly ever succeeded. Then, not being aware of the hour of departure in the morning, they slept too late, and on waking found the Russians upon them. Thousands of men were taken prisoners and perished in this way. I kept near the fire, standing and trembling all over, and leaning on my musket. 3 men were sitting round the fire in silence, mechanically watching people passing in the road, seeming disposed to stay where they were, simply for want of strength to move. I began to be uneasy at not seeing my regiment pass when I felt someone pull at my bearskin cloak. It was Grandier come to tell me that the regiment was passing, but my eyes were so worn out that I could not see him, even looking straight at him. "And the woman," he said, "who told you anything about her?" "The sergeant major, but where is she?" "I don't know, but I do know that she has a knapsack full of linen, which I want badly. And if ever you meet her, you might tell me. She is dressed in a soldier's grey cloak with a sheepskin cap on her head. She wears black gaiters, and she carries a basket on her arm." Grandier thought, as he afterwards told me, that I was light-headed, and taking me by the arm, he led me down the road, saying, "We must get on, or we shall not catch up with the regiment." We came up with it, however, after passing the thousands of men from all kinds of regiments who walked confusedly, hardly able to drag themselves along. We foresaw, on looking at them, that the journey, if long, would be a fatal one to most of us. The march was indeed a long one. We passed the place where the emperor was supposed to sleep, although he had got far in advance of it. A great number of men stopped here, for it was very late, and we heard that 2 leagues separated us yet from our bivouac in a large forest. The road here was very wide, and bordered on each side by birch trees. There was plenty of room for us, and the carts and wagons. But when evening came on, there was nothing to be seen all the length of the road but dead horses, and the further we advanced, the more the road became blocked with carts and dying horses. All teams succumbed at once from fatigue. The men who could go no further stopped and made bivouacs underneath large trees. Here they said they had wood at hand to make fires from the broken carts and horse flesh to eat, and these they would not find further on. That concludes the 10th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.